Everybody. I'm just really pleased to be able to announce or to introduce Sanjay Reddy to you. At least half of you, I guess, already have had experience with him in the master course, but for those of you who haven't yet, you're in for a real treat. You're gonna. Sanjay's a person that one of the few people I could just listen to his talking about economics and social theory for hours on end. He's just a fascinating, learned, insightful person. And he's an associate professor of economics at the New School. Do we still say for social research, or do we just say New School?
Okay. You can say either, actually. Okay,
the New School for Social Research. He has fascinating academic background. He did his BA in applied mathematics and physics at Harvard University, and then he did an MPhil in social anthropology at Cambridge. He did a second master's in economics at Harvard, and then a PhD in economics at Harvard. And that breadth, that educational breadth, I think, is well reflected in his ability to talk about so many different matters. I was looking at a little bit at his CV, and he teaches courses on subjects like microeconomics, advanced microeconomics, presumably fairly mathematical, I would suppose, development economics, but then also a course called The Critique of Economic Reason, which I suppose is going to have something to do with our talk today on the predicament of economics. He's published in lots of different economic journals and other kinds of journals, including, for example, Ethics and International Affairs, but as well in journals like the Quarterly Review of Economics and Finance, the Journal of Development Studies. He's also active in the Human Development and Capabilities Association, and he's edited a book on India and Indian political economy called The Great Transformation, Understanding India's New Political Economy. And he was a co-author of a book, for those of you who are interested in global justice, he co-authored a book with I want to say Brian Barry, not Brian Barry. Thank you. Christian Barry on trade and labor standards, on linking trade and labor standards, which I think is just a fabulous book. It's one of the best books to read if you're interested in global justice, and particularly in sort of the trade policy in global justice. It's incredibly insightful, and it has this rare combination of really understanding how the world works and a sophisticated grasp of normative theory. And I think that's just typical of Sanjay in general. So please join me in welcoming Sanjay Reddy, speaking to us about the predicament of economics.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Daryl, for that really overly generous introduction, very kind and unmerited. But thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here in Frankfurt and in the Excellence Cluster on Normative Orders, because this is one of the only places where one can have a broad-ranging discussion that brings in normative and empirical issues at the high level that's present here, and I think unabashedly integrate them, which is something I value a lot and think is the way forward, but is rarely, if ever, seen in the world. So quite apart from the individual treasures who are here, including Daryl and Rainer and others, I'm glad of that atmosphere, and with it also, of course, the openness to discussing many different fundamental as well as applied issues, and to move between them seamlessly. So, as Daryl mentioned, my topic today is a little bit reflexive. I'm going to be thinking, or attempting to think, a little about the situation of the economics discipline of which I am a part, or in part a part, since it's one of my identities and aspects of my formation. I teach in an economics department. But increasingly, as all of you will be aware, the question of the role of economics in the world is something that matters a lot for people outside of the discipline, or the profession, as it likes to call itself. Very often economists, especially in the US, refer to themselves as having a profession. A profession without, until recently, any professional norms or standards, actually. But they like to use that phrase. I think it's become increasingly evident that political projects of various kinds are constrained by economics, and that the views of economists play a very significant role in determining where the boundaries or perceived boundaries of those projects lie. One of my examples in the course of my remarks this afternoon will be the Eurozone crisis, and I think that's one clear example in which the perspectives of economists have played a very central role in the unfolding of that crisis, and on different sides of the debate at different moments, but they've certainly played a very central role. And certainly if some of those views had been different, one might have seen a different unfolding of the crisis. So it matters for broader political and social projects what this discipline thinks and how it operates. But of course, the best known example of the role of the discipline in recent years in terms of the broader consequences that it has had is the 2008 crisis, and the role that the economics discipline is perceived to have played in the lead up to that crisis, either in terms of acts of commission, for example, actively recommending and promoting forms of financial deregulation which may have played a causal role in the origins of the crisis, especially in the United States, but also elsewhere, or in terms of acts of omission, notably their failure to take note of the pressure that was building up in the system and the potential vulnerabilities and fragilities which existed. No less a person, can I use that word, phrase? Maybe I shouldn't, than the Queen of England asked the Royal Economic Society, "What went wrong? Why did you not see the crisis coming?" And the Royal Economic Society, taking the first word in its title quite seriously, made an effort to respond at length to the Queen. After some 6 months or a year, they produced a lengthy letter, response to the Queen of England as to why we didn't see it coming. And if you actually read that letter, you'll see that there's a bit of a mea culpa, but also a defense of the profession. But certainly, I think it's fair to say that the discipline was quite out of touch with aspects of the reality which underpinned the crisis. I mean, all of us, I think, learned terms, or at least many of us did, such as the subprime concept of a subprime mortgage or collateralized debt obligation, which we didn't know about before. But it wasn't just lay people, it was also economists, including financial economists, who it turned out had very little clue about these things until the stuff hit the fan, as they say, the crisis erupted. So there was a disconnection from reality, a perceived complaisance and complacence, both, a willingness to roll over and promote the interests of particular financial and economic interests, among other things. You are probably familiar with the film Inside Job, which is I think, fairly good portrayal of this. There's some well-known American economists who appear in that film, who are interviewed and who are really unable to defend the role that they played in terms of these acts of commission as well as omission. I mentioned that until recently, the economics profession had not had any type of real professional code. And I said that because one of the consequences of the Inside Job and other efforts to put a spotlight on what the economics discipline had not done or had done before the crisis was to generate a bit of a discussion about this, which culminated in the American Economic Association adopting a code of conduct for economists, which is a fairly thin code, but nevertheless it is a code where none existed before. So, for example, in Inside Job, one of those who was interviewed turns out to have advised the Icelandic regulatory authority to undertake deregulation, while at the same time having also served as a consultant for financial interests which would have benefited from such a deregulation. So that type of direct conflict of interest, which was not specifically precluded in the past by a code of conduct for economists, is now at least made more difficult by economists, for instance, having to reveal what conflicts they have and to do so in academic publications that they have. Okay. So it's in this context that I began to reflect a little bit about the situation of the discipline, and my doing so reflected not only these broader events and this broader atmosphere of a desire for a scrutiny of the discipline and a rethinking of how the discipline operates, but also my own dissatisfaction, going back really to the origins of my study of the subject, in some aspects of how it presented itself to the world and how it presented itself to itself. And here I'd like to refer to one feature in particular, which is its scientism. The notion, in other words, that economics is a science understood in a particular way, and here I refer to it not in the German understanding of the term as the systematic pursuit of a discipline, but much more in the Anglo-American understanding, which is a field which reveals the underlying laws or regularities which operate in a domain so as to generate predictable consequences. Okay. So it's a much narrower conception of what it means to call something a science that's being invoked when economists in the US in particular, which is the epicenter of global economics, the center and the epicenter, when they do so. And I had always been troubled by this, because I felt that there were aspects of this claim which were misleading, even deeply misleading. But I also realized that I didn't properly understand why it was so important for the discipline, apparently so important, to continually emphasize this point, that it was a science, right? So whether it's in its internal communications in the context of professors teaching graduate students, for example, or its communications within the profession, in its annual meetings and other such occasions, or indeed in its external role, perhaps crucially in its external role, of projecting itself before the broader society and offering advice to government and regulatory authorities and entering or influencing the public debate. The emphasis that economics had a scientific offering seemed to be extremely crucial, extremely central at any rate to its discourse about itself. And why was this the case? I felt I needed to understand this better, in part to relieve my own sense of discomfort at what I intuited was in some sense a false claim, all along intuited, though I didn't always have the I would say, capability to really make good on an explanation of why that was the case. Okay, so that's another more personal source of this of the motivation for this subject. I don't want to speak for too long, and I've already spoken for quite some time. So what I would like to do is just run through relatively quickly 3 different aspects of an argument, and then perhaps we can have a multilateral discussion about this. So the first aspect of the argument that I would like to present concerns what I would call the fact of disagreement. I would like to argue that there is a pervasive reality of disagreement about important questions to do with economics and the economy. So that's the first proposition, the fact of disagreement. The second proposition, the second aspect of the argument, will concern the reasons for that disagreement, in which I would like to sketch very provisionally some ideas as to why that disagreement that I have already noted to exist does exist. And the third concerns the question of how we should handle that disagreement. And the we in question here could be and is the profession itself, the so-called profession, right? How it should conceive of itself and its role in light of the preceding, but also how society should relate to the discipline and what expectations society should have or can have from it, and how in some sense it should also discipline the discipline in order to avoid some of the worst outcomes that can result, and to ensure a better relationship between the discipline and public purposes of various kinds. Okay, so let me start with the fact of disagreement. And Darryl, should I go on for 20 minutes more, or what do you say?
How long have you been going on?
I don't know, 10 minutes?
You've been going on for 15 minutes. I think you can go on for at least 20 minutes.
Okay, all right. I'll try to keep it to roughly that.
At least.
Okay, excellent.
Half an hour would be fine, too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so that will give us enough time. But I want to also have enough time for discussion. So, the fact of disagreement. I think that the public is often confused by the fact that economists disagree, right? They famously disagree. Harry Truman is said to have asked, this is an old saw, which most economists, I think, know, said to have asked for a one-handed economist, because every individual economist used to say on the one hand and on the other hand. So that's the intrapersonal problem, quite apart from the interpersonal problem, that different economists, even when they do have views, have different views, right? So economists famously hedge their bets or disagree internally or disagree externally. And that is evident with respect to a wide range of issues, right? It's certainly clear-cut when it comes to policy recommendations that there are economists who are on different sides of a policy argument, more often than not. And indeed, each side will seek to mobilize its economists, much as people who are in a court of law seek to mobilize lawyers to help plead their case in the court of public policy or the court of public opinion. So it's clear-cut that economists have that function, argumentative function. And this, of course, led to Joan Robinson famously suggesting that the primary use of economists is in negating other economists, which may well be the case. And that might be the primary use of lawyers, too. So it's a second-best argument for the existence of economists. So you have economists who are clearly on both sides of the debate, and you have economic arguments on both sides, and so naturally the public is often confused. Of course, it's not always the case that there are two sides or more than two sides to the debate which are brought to public attention. Sometimes there is an appearance that is created of consensus. I say an appearance because very often, even in those cases, I think, if one goes a little bit beneath the surface, one sees that something else is true, right? So a good example of the latter would be the argument on trade, where for a very long time it was suggested that the vast majority of economists all agreed, in fact, anybody with economics training at all agreed, that free trade was desirable. But that wasn't really true, because there was a minority, in fact, quite a thoughtful minority, which had a different view. But it was a minority, admittedly. It was a marginalized group in some ways. But I think it would be hard to say that it was senseless, right? So, for example, my colleague Anwar Sheikh, who's clearly was a member of this minority for many decades, has long argued that in relation to trade, it's absolute advantage, not comparative advantage, which really matters, and that with free capital mobility and the ability for countries, therefore, to run deficits for very long periods of time, it is the case that absolute advantage rather than comparative advantage is what will determine the pattern of trade, which could well lead to losses for a country and gains for another country, okay, as opposed to gains from trade for both. And so that's, I think, quite an impeccable theoretical argument, but one which was ignored by the profession. So it wouldn't be right, wouldn't have ever been right to say that reasonable opinion was all on one side, even if it was true as a matter of the sociology of the discipline that the vast majority of economists were on one side. So certainly in the United States and in the mainstream of the economics profession generally. So there were such cases as well where the fact of disagreement didn't come to the surface. That didn't mean that there wasn't disagreement, right? But then there are other cases where the fact of disagreement is much closer to the surface. And I'll give you one simple example of that, which is something that came up in relation to the Eurozone crisis. And this concerns the question of what is the effect of an increase or a decrease in government expenditure. Right? What is the multiplier that connects output, the effect on national output, to an increase in or a decrease in government expenditure? This is a very important question, or was a very important question in relation to the Eurozone crisis, because the issue of, for instance, how much fiscal retrenchment Greece could undertake in order to stabilize its economy and repay its creditors hinged on this issue. And it turned out that the assumptions which were made by the Troika, which is to say the European Commission, the IMF, and the ECB together, were much too optimistic in that regard. The IMF was actually on one end of this argument, and the IMF view turned out to be closer to what actually happened, which was that the fiscal retrenchment which took place in Greece actually caused a much larger contraction than was expected, which made it harder to stabilize the Greek economy and return Greece to a pathway in which it was creditworthy or perceived as creditworthy. So that's an example of a very specific causal question, right, with respect to what is a number? What is the size of that multiplier? Is it positive? Is it negative? And how large is it? Which would be relevant for determining whether Greece had to undertake a very considerable belt tightening or only a small one, or none at all, or perhaps it ought to have had none at all in order to be able to be a creditworthy borrower and have a prospect of repaying its debts. Now, in this context, there emerged a very interesting debate. Alberto Alessina, an Italian economist at Harvard, and Francesco Giavazzi, I think he's at Bocconi, if I'm not wrong, right, wrote a paper and then a book which many other economists considered absolutely outlandish, but which nevertheless was quite influential in the policy debate, in which they argued, or they claimed to argue on the basis of a very large number of episodes from the past, that austerity could actually be expansionary, that tightening your belt could actually lead to an increase in national income. And this struck many other professional economists, as well as others, as being bizarre. Okay? But nevertheless, it was not just quite seriously argued, but had quite a considerable influence in the policy debate. So that's an example of a connection between a very fundamental theoretical and empirical question addressed by academic economists and the policy discourse, right? And of course, on the other side, you had other people arguing more conventionally that fiscal retrenchment would actually also lead to a decrease in national income. Okay. So you can quite easily, in these kinds of contexts, see the connections, see the threads that link academic economists concerned with specific kinds of issues and positions in the policy debate. So although they're not the same actors, and they're not always even expressing the ideas in the same way, there is clearly a connection there to be drawn. The example of the debate on austerity and stimulus is, I think, an interesting one, because one can go back 200 years and find a version of this debate then. John Maynard Keynes, in The General Theory, has an appendix in which he discusses Malthus and Ricardo and their views on the impact of austerity and stimulus, essentially. And although they were not using the same argumentative tools, they weren't using modern statistics, they weren't using the same language, one can clearly see the contours of the current debate even 200 years ago. Right? Now, of course, each generation invents its own language. Indeed, Keynes invented his own language, with which he was able to articulate the position of Malthus in the debate with Ricardo on that issue in a different way. But nevertheless, the fact that the fault lines were more or less continuous and unchanged over 200 plus years is, I think, something that is not merely fascinating, but also in a way alarming. If we think that this is the sort of discipline that ought to have an answer to a question which is descriptive, explanatory, and predictive, such as that of what is the multiplier, what is the effect which one can reasonably expect a change in fiscal expenditure on the part of government to have. Right? Now, if one has the German conception of science, it's Wissenschaft, systematic pursuit of knowledge, there isn't a problem there. But if one has this narrower Anglo-Saxon, so to speak, predictive conception, then one is a bit worried, because it means that either the other side consists of charlatans and yet are never extinguished, even though they're charlatans, right? Or the claim is false. So which is it? Now, I don't need to elaborate on this too much, but I think it's fair to say, and all of you will no doubt have your own examples, that in the natural sciences, Naturwissenschaft, this is not the case, right? And my favorite example, there are innumerable examples, but my recent favorite example is that of the structure of the DNA molecule, which it turns out Erwin Schrödinger in 1944 in a debate he gave in a lecture he gave in Ireland, which was published under the title "What is Life?" in many ways predicted. Okay, so on the basis of abstract reasoning about what he called the molecule of life would have to look like in order to serve the function that it would have to have in carrying genetic information from generation to generation, he was able to predict some of its features. And then, of course, Watson and Crick gave that much more specificity, and it was experimentally verified that the DNA molecule has a certain structure, the double helix. Right? So there was room for debate, but then the debate was resolved. Of course, that doesn't mean every aspect of the debate is resolved. For instance, the question of what role DNA plays in the transmission of genetic information remains open. Turns out that RNA also plays a role. And now there's a discussion about what's called epigenetics, whether environment actually influences this gene transmission process, reviving an old idea which was once considered discredited. So it's not that the debate has ended, but aspects of the debate are resolved fully. Right? This has no parallel in economics. None. In fact, I've heard the question asked, and I've myself put the question, and I have never heard an answer. Is there any single question in economics which has ever been decisively resolved on the basis of statistical evidence? there are, of course, those who are champions, partisans of one side, who might argue that they're right and the charlatans on the other side are wrong. But taking a more dispassionate view, I think it's hard to say that that's the case, and that is indeed troubling. So there's something about the nature of this subject matter which is actually bedeviling its own claims to be scientific in this narrow sense, right? And that ought to be troubling for economists, but apparently isn't, which is itself very interesting. Okay. So why would you make these claims about scientificity which are hard to bear out? Well, obviously it conveys authority. And I struggle against being too simplistic here, but I feel I have to some extent, at least consider the simple and maybe simplistic thesis. It helps to legitimate by conferring the authority of being right when others are wrong. And to the extent that one can be bolstered by that in the public policy debate in one way or another, presenting the others as snake oil salespeople, that of course is helpful in shoring up a view. Right? And if we think about the neoliberal order, broadly speaking, of course it benefited from that. Right? The WTO, for instance, is clearly an example of the influence of free trade theory, even though there are aspects of it which are not wholly consistent with free trade theories. For example, according to traditional free trade theory, every country should have a unilateral interest in liberalizing regardless of what other countries do. But the WTO is grounded instead on the premise that countries have to mutually agree to lower their trade barriers in order to bring it about sustainably. And so there was a political logic behind the WTO which wasn't fully anticipated perhaps in the theory, though after the fact many economists and lawyers tried to explain why that, and political scientists, why that might be the case. Okay, so that's the fact of disagreement. I will resist going on about that, but one could. Any economic issue, let me just end that part of the discussion by saying practically any economic issue, I think, that has broader public policy relevance is could be an example of this. And perhaps we can go into the discussion to see, to follow that challenge through of examining how in each specific case there are such disagreements. Okay, what are the reasons? Well, here again I struggle against being too simplistic, but I think one would have to say that one of the reasons, at least to a first approximation, that there are disagreements is that there are interests. There are interests behind the different resolutions of the argument, or in favor of the different resolutions of the argument, and therefore there are interests that favor certain theories that lead to certain resolutions rather than others. Now, this, of course, does not mean that every economist is for sale, right? But it does mean that there is, and here's again a working metaphor for thinking about this, there's a force field in intellectual life which operates in various ways, which deflects or shapes the creation of ideas, the dissemination of ideas, and the reception of ideas. And this is crucial because it is part of the reason, a very central reason, for it not being the case in economics, unlike in, for example, biology or physics, that there is the ability for the community of scientists to concur that certain things are true and other things are false. The community is so riven, so to speak, by these different fault lines generated by the force field in its operations that it is not able to develop a scientific consensus on such matters, or if it is, it's often an ersatz consensus, which eventually is put under suspicion, as in the case of free trade and its automatic benefits. So, how should we understand this force field? Well, of course, in the case of economics, and I think this is true of all the social sciences, but perhaps it's especially true of economics, you have an entire ecology of actors. It's not just the academic departments, it's the think tanks, it's the policy intellectuals around the political parties, trade unions, and whatever else. Not so much trade unions these days, business associations, of course, chambers of commerce, and so forth. Those in governments and international organizations who are part and parcel of of these dynamics, right? Creation, dissemination, reception, and that can mean that certain voices are louder than others, have the amplifier or the loudspeaker, and others don't. But it can also mean that, even to the extent that that's not the case, that there is great difficulty in achieving any type of consensus within the discipline of a genuine kind. That's enduring, in particular. Now, quite apart from interest, it seems to me there are other very important factors, and we shouldn't lose sight of them lest we be too reductionist. We're sitting here in Germany, and we all know, because Germany is famous for this in the whole world, that Germans are very averse to inflation, we're told, right? And why are they averse to inflation? They have had certain historical experiences that have made them averse to inflation, we're told. And indeed, one could even argue that the anti-inflationary interests in Europe as a whole have taken advantage of German anti-inflationism by creating the ECB structure with its particular rules, which was only acceptable at its origins to Germany and to Germans, by building in a deep aversion to inflation, right, and to monetization in general. But of course, that's also a reason why the European debt crisis has unfolded in the way it has, because that tying the system to the mast by committing it from the first to a deep anti-inflationism has also made it very difficult to resolve the crisis through either monetary or fiscal expansion, which could enable that. So that's an example of a broader perspectival contribution, right, in this case of the Germans' historical experience, to the reception of particular ideas. In this case, more to do with policy than perhaps with fundamental understandings of how an economy works. But those two things are not completely detachable again, right? So for instance, not everybody who actually works on inflation in the academic world thinks that inflation is fundamentally a monetary phenomenon. I think Milton Friedman famously said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. I would have thought, by the way, the philosophers can correct me, always includes everywhere. But anyway, he found it necessary to say that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And I think in some broad sense, that's the German view, popular view, because of historical experience. And that's a big part of why the ECB is constrained in the way it is. And of course, governments are also fiscally constrained so as to prevent them from having the temptation to monetize their debts, as it's seen. But if you have a different theory of inflation, then that would be less of a, as some people do, less of a concern. Okay, so there are those kinds of perspectival issues which are not perhaps reducible to interest. And then, and I think this is perhaps the most significant issue, and in some ways more subtle, the economic system is not like the natural world in various ways, but centrally it is because of individual and collective agency operating on the economic and social system that it is not like the natural world. And specifically, the exercise of that agency makes the economy, to use statistical jargon or terminology, non-stationary. Okay? It changes the data generating process, again using statistical jargon. So what is the relationship between inflation and output, or whatever it is, unemployment and output? The economists typically undertake statistical inferential exercises to understand what these relations are. But of course, each institutional context shapes these relations in very fundamental ways. And it does so not just because institutional rules are different, but because the expectations which are created on the part of actors and their behaviors which are consequent upon those are also different. Okay, so let's look at the ECB and the European debt crisis, excuse me, as an example. Part of the difficulty with working out what would be a solution to the crisis comes from the fact that nothing like it has ever been experienced before, to state the obvious, right? This is a unique situation. A multinational compact to share a currency with the particular institutional arrangements and rules which undergird it, which mean that some of the old solutions which were available or would have been available for an individual country, such as depreciating its individual currency, are not available, right? And other solutions which could be potentially available would require a reworking of those rules which define it. So there are aspects of the institutional order which are sui generis, which have come into being as a consequence of the particular historical trajectory which brought it about. And of course you can say that, you know, what happened, one can discuss whether what happened in some other specific episode which was institutionally dissimilar has something to offer by way of insight, which could help us to understand what to do here. But even so, one would have to import that lesson and embed it in the current scenario, in which there are aspects that are not just different, but different to such an extent and in such a way that it may raise a real question as to whether that importation is valid. Right? So when Yanis Varoufakis, for example, complains about how economic orthodoxy was embedded at the heart of the system and created very few degrees of freedom for not just for Greece but for other debtor countries, or for reworking the rules, I think that is in part an argument that there was a lack of adequate imagination, perhaps for interested reasons, on the part of those concerned. Where imagination would have been exactly what was necessary here, precisely because of the unique nature of this particular setting or situation. So the fact that these processes operate in and through institutional contexts which are ever-changing, that there are also cultural and expectational elements which are important to the behaviors of agents and so on, are extremely relevant to the formation of inferences, right? Something that I have written about in a different context is that of randomized controlled trials in development, where the notion is that if you figure out that something works in one place, then you can apply it in another place. But that in turn, the so-called problem of external validity is encountered there. That in turn presumes that whatever it is that's the causal mechanism which is in place in setting A is also in place or active and dominant in setting B. But there may be, I would say there are, deep-seated reasons that that kind of transferability is often not possible, and fundamentally they relate to the non-mechanistic nature of human society and human beings for this purpose. Okay, may I just step back a little bit and just, I want to just note a little coda on the question of interests before moving on to the third theme. You know, sometimes in talking about these issues, we assume that it's fairly straightforward to interpret what people's interests are. But I think that actually it's quite difficult at times to interpret what the interests are. And let me give one simple example. I was taught when I was a student of economics by my more political economy-oriented teachers. And I'm sure they also had a more sophisticated account, but when they would talk about this issue, they would seem to say, at least this is what I perceive them to say, that rentiers, capital owners, have an interest, at least financial rentiers, those who gain their money from financial speculation, and in particular by lending it out, have an interest in higher interest rates. Okay, so you might think from that standpoint that it would be clear-cut that there would be certain groups of people, banks, pensioners, others who would support higher interest rates, right? But nowadays it's less obvious. again, in the context of the Eurozone crisis, let me elaborate on this. Quantitative easing is the process that the ECB and other central banks have been undertaking following on the Japanese central banks' pioneering of this. Of course, the Federal Reserve has been doing it, of buying a broad range of financial assets so as to lower interest rates. Right? Now, the low interest rates that have been created have in turn made it easy for people to borrow money for various speculative financial purposes. So the hedge funds actually like very much low interest rates because it facilitates that. Any leveraged trade, which is a way to magnify your potential gains in the event of a price increase by borrowing money in order to speculate with borrowed money, benefits from having lower interest rates. So all of those financial interests whose strategies are grounded in that type of transaction like quantitative easing from that standpoint. And indeed, we have seen an increase in share prices as a consequence, right, of all of the leveraged purchases of shares that have been undertaken by private equity firms, hedge funds, and so forth. And of course, existing bondholders benefit from these purchases because they drive up the prices. So it's true that if you're lending out your money afresh, you're going to get less for it. But if you already own a lot of bonds, you get to sell them at a higher rate now because their price has been driven up by quantitative easing. In the bond market, this is what's called the roll return. The fact that you can resell the bonds you actually own, you already own, which you purchased at a lower price, now at a higher price. So this is an example of where it's now not so obvious who benefits from the interest rate in a particular way. And so what I'm not sure about is whether arguments for and against quantitative easing are clearly linked to particular interests, nor what those interests are. What I am clear on is that there are interests, and that shapes the discipline in some fashion. Okay. Let me move on to the third theme so that we can conclude and hopefully have time for discussion. The handling of disagreement. So this is where I am most at a loss, I have to say. It would be nice to offer a solution. But of course, there are no solutions to such questions. You know, no more than there's a solution to the question of whether my wife and I can find a way to stop quarreling ever. Right? I mean, it would be nice if we could find a solution which would prevent us from ever quarreling again. But on the other hand, it seems to be part of the condition of our having a relationship that whatever its positive features and the different aspects of flourishing which we may experience in that relationship, we also experience the challenge of disagreement and of being able to handle it. Now, that's not perhaps surprising. It's in the nature of all relationships that that is the case. I have been at times tempted to say that a tragic view of life is what is mandated here, but I don't know that it's even that tragic, because actually it's a quotidian type of realization we have, not only in personal life but also in politics. We have to find a way to navigate disagreement and to live in the presence of disagreement, right? Without simply adopting the rhetoric that I'm right and you are wrong, which is how it seems to mostly go, at least in the discipline of economics. So is there a way in which the discipline could gain a degree of reflexivity so that it could realize that perhaps it's not simply a question of my being right and your being wrong, but it's a question of our both having a different gestalt, a different framework for seeing what it is that we see. You see a duck and I see a rabbit, and it's not that you're right and I'm wrong. You might try to convince me that it's a duck rather than a rabbit, and you might even be right. There may even be a fact of the matter, right? And that's something I didn't emphasize before, and perhaps I should emphasize. You know, with respect to the multiplier, for instance, maybe there is a fact of the matter. It's a subjunctive which is involved. What would be the effect of an expansion of government expenditure in Germany on output in Germany, right? All other things being equal. But there may be a fact of the matter in some sense to that. But that of course, is not a great comfort if we're never going to agree on what the fact of the matter is, because we're operating in this force field, and we're not going to agree. We haven't agreed for 200 years, so it's not clear why we're about to agree now, or why we should be optimistic that in the next 50 years we're going to agree, as opposed to thinking that there is going to be a continued basis for plurality in a debate of this nature. Okay, so how should we handle the disagreement beyond making a false assertion of a consensus, right? Projecting an ersatz consensus that doesn't exist. So I would like to suggest three possibilities, all of which I think have some reflections in the world, or on occasion at least we can see some glimmers of these, right? The first is what we might call contestation. Right? So this is a more robust type of confrontation of ideas of different kinds and theories of different kinds. You know, Karl Popper thought, I think, that such contestation would lead to one view being falsified in favor of another. But that might not be the result of contestation, but nevertheless contestation may lead to clarification by making clear what it is that may be provisionally or conditionally agreed upon and what is in fact disagreed about, and what is the basis of that disagreement, therefore leading in some sense to a more sophisticated debate. Right? So what is a more robust contestation, and why is it needed? Well, I would say the discipline of economics, probably more than any other social science, has been dominated by, and I didn't give a lot of time to this earlier, but I think it's true, dominated by certain perspectives, a mainstream with a certain methodological core, even though that's become a bit more eclectic in recent years, and broad orientations. So to bring to the round table of debate genuinely different perspectives that can contest in a more forthright and direct way is, I think, one step that can be taken to generate a more honest discipline, which is also more engaged with the world in an honest way. I mean, internally honest and externally honest. Of course, in order for different ideas to contest, they have to exist in the first place. They each have to have a loudspeaker. It's not enough for one to have a loudspeaker and the other not. In Germany, for example, I understand that you have economic think tanks which are associated with the trade unions, and you have economic think tanks which are associated with the business association. So you have different schools of thought which are present in some sense or reflected in these different political and social positionings. Okay. And that may enable a degree of real contestation, one can hope, to take place. The second thought would be that compromise, of some extent, is one solution. Right? In Germany, again, not to uphold the Germans as the exemplars of everything, but in Germany you have co-determination. Right? You have the idea that workers have representatives on supervisory boards of companies. Right? Now that's an example of bringing to bear a contrary interest, right, in the decision-making structure, so that elements of compromise are necessitated, and perhaps of justificatory demands of various sorts within the supervisory board. Similarly, one could think of central banks having much more of this kind of aspect, having democratic representation of different social and economic interest groups. And I think to some extent that has existed in the case of central banks, though it has been pushed to the margins in recent decades because of the fad for inflation targeting, which is focused on the idea that central banks should have one and only one objective, which is to keep inflation as low as possible, and that objective is best entrusted to very hawkish monetary economists who are devoted to that idea. right? So the notion that there's a broader range of democratic responsibilities which should be in some sense engaged is not so much present. Interestingly, the US Federal Reserve is an exception to that because it has a so-called dual mandate to address employment as well as inflation, even though it pays much more heed in its language to the to inflation concerns, one might argue. But at any rate, it has a dual mandate. So compromise is one within institutional structures, in part through representation of a broad range of actors and voices, is one other conscious or reflexive response to this problem. Right? Now, a third possibility, which I think would not, and a third thought, a third image of the response, which I think would not apply in every setting, it could not apply in every setting, but it could apply in some, is what I might call conviviality. So conviviality is the idea that different schools of thought, ways of thinking about how to organize an economy or what an economy is and what works, can and should be permitted to flourish. Danny Roderick has argued something along these lines with respect to the international trading and financial systems. He has said essentially, or he's argued, that countries should have more space, more policy space, as he calls it. Joe Stiglitz, I think, has also argued something quite similar with respect to the international order. Countries should have more policy space to choose those policies which are appropriate for their conditions and their goals. Of course, there can be different goals, but there can also be different understandings of how best to promote the goals that one has. Right? And to the extent that one has a structural adjustment promoting international order as one had in the 1980s, certainly, and to some extent thereafter, from the part of the IMF and other international institutions, that was the opposite, right? Telling countries they had to adopt a certain narrow range of policies, that those were the only policies good for them, and that was because the economists knew best. So what Roderick and Stiglitz and others would say we need is instead an international order which does have rules of some kind and principles, but is also oriented toward providing countries policy space to do a wider range of things, thereby making possible a diversity of experiments and hence a possibility of conviviality, living together while being different. Right? Now, of course, that's not a solution which is available when you are talking about a single set of rules that binds everyone, as in the Eurozone crisis. Right? You're going to have a single policy solution, at least at some levels of that problem and with respect to some aspects of that problem. But even within that European Union context, there may be other aspects which could benefit from subsidiarity, so to speak. Right? So, for instance, the question of whether the surpluses in the European Union, which are earned by countries such as Germany, should be more systematically deployed in a pro-investment, productivity-enhancing way in the peripheral countries, is probably something that has to be decided at the central level. Right? There has to be one solution, that's in some sense, to the question of whether those surpluses are to be channeled in such a way. On the other hand, the question of how exactly those surpluses are to be spent, or how one could imagine they're being employed to facilitate productivity enhancement, is something that could be handled in a much more subsidiary fashion. Okay, so this is all weak tea, I'm afraid, because asking the economics discipline to have a self-aware approach in relation to these questions and to consciously welcome pluralism within itself is perhaps too much to ask for. On the other hand, I think that a fuller awareness on the part of society that the nature of the disagreements in question is as I have suggested, in other words, not subject to the scientistic framing of the problem, could and would, I would suggest, potentially lead in a very different direction. So let me stop there.
Thanks so much.